Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 9 on Language Development for Developmental Psychology. Today we have a couple goals that we want to talk about. First, we want to understand the major theories of language development. There's kind of two competing theories, and we'll get into them in depth. And if you know anything about what I'm interested in this course, you'll understand that one theory suggests that heredity and genes are important in language development, and the other theory suggests that the environment is more important in language development. Our second goal here is to understand the development of our different language, aspects of our language, including phonology, semantics, the development of grammar, and pragmatics, or the meaning of words, and so forth. So let's start off here, and you kind of should probably think about how you would define language. If I asked every student in this class to write down their definition of language, they would all probably write something similar down, but not exactly the same. We all know what language is, but it's actually hard to define in certain terms. And since this is a science course, we need to define it and have a working definition. Another thing you should kind of ponder here is, what do you think makes language different from other species communication? And I'm probably just going to tell you now that humans are the only species with language. Many species communicate and communicate very effectively, but humans are really the only species with language. And we define language in a special way, or we define human communication in a special way. It is symbolic in nature. If I wrote the letter A on the board, it has no inherent meaning, but we all know what it means, we all learned what it means, and it has developed a meaning for our species. Human language is also special in that it has specific rules. You don't see specific rules when the great apes communicate with each other, dolphins communicate with each other, and so forth. Human language is special because although there are similar rules between languages, it does vary with culture, and you don't necessarily see that in other species. So our working definition here for language is the systematic use of sounds, signs, and symbols for communication. And really the key word that makes this language is the word systematic. All language is communication, but not all communication is technically language. So, acquiring language implies that we understand its form and the meaning of it. So there are a couple different things that I'm actually going to talk about later in the lecture here, but you should probably be aware of these as we go through the different theories. So phonology is going to refer to the sounds of language, the sounds that we make, whereas semantics is the meaning behind those sounds. Grammar includes the rules such as punctuation, sentence structure, predicate and subject agreement, and so forth. And pragmatics is how we use our language in different situations, how we speak to different people in different situations. So keep that in mind when we talk about these major modern theories. Both of the theories that I'm going to talk about today acknowledge that biology and the environment are important for language acquisition. If you remember, we are beyond the question of whether it's nature or nurture. But most of these things that we talk about in this class involve both nature and nurture. The next level question is, to what degree does nature affect the development of said phenomenon, and to what degree does the environment affect said phenomenon? The two theories, the first one is the nativist theory. The nativist generally suggests that there's an evolutionary adaptation for our language development, and we're kind of born with this broad theory of language, and it's modified by the speech that we hear. So genes are more important for the nativists, whereas social interactionists suggest that we gain language from our interactions with others. Okay, so it's more of an environmental component. Now, there is research that supports both of these, and let's talk about some of the research and some of the logical reasoning behind why nativists suggest that genes have a very important component to our language development. Nativists essentially argue that all children have a predisposition for acquiring their culture's language. So it's not simply a product of learning. We are prepared to learn. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Lots of evidence supports this claim. For instance, language is species-specific. So, regardless of which language you speak, the rules are basically the same. We generally develop it across cultures and so forth. So unless you're not in a species-typical environment, meaning you've been abused or experienced some phenomenon that other people did not, you're going to develop language. So only humans possess language. With that said, some apes can be taught simple sign language, but we mostly only see it in humans. Language is difficult to prevent, and if you heard of the case of Jeannie Wiley, the feral child, she was abused for the first 12 years of her life and had no social interactions. She could develop some components of language, but she had a very difficult time learning the grammar and the sentence structures that we acquire over time. So if you'd like to learn more about her, you can probably just Google a video on Jeannie Wiley. Very difficult for her to learn language. But once she left the abusive environment, she did learn some language basics. Language develops in a regular sequence across cultures. So all around the world, children acquire language in about the same way or time. Just like all around the world, children tend to start walking around 12 months. They start talking around 12 months as well. One piece of evidence that really kind of makes me take more of the nativist perspective is that there are specific anatomical structures for language. So that indicates to me that there's a strong evolutionary component. Our mouths and throat structures are suited well for language development, and we have specific brain structures where if there's damage to this specific brain structures, for instance Broca's area and Wernicke's area, then we have specific language issues. For instance, if you have a stroke or blunt trauma to Broca's area, these individuals have a difficult time producing language, whereas if you have a stroke to Wernicke's area, we have a difficulty expressing correct language. So we can produce the speech, but we can't really understand what other people are saying to us, and therefore we respond with basic gibberish. There'll be a couple videos attached to this lecture video here that you can look at on the Learning Management System Canvas. I'll show you two individuals that have Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. More evidence to support this nativist perspective is that language disabilities seem to be genetically based. So there are even some suggestions that some of these disabilities are monogenetic, meaning there's one gene that affects the development of some of these language issues, and language issues tend to run in families as well. So all of this led the famous Noam Chomsky, one of the famous language researchers, to suggest that human beings are prepared to have this universal grammar. It's the innate grammar that characterizes all of our languages. So whether you speak Spanish, French, English, or any other language, there are certain rules for those languages, and they tend to be the same between languages. Now, there might be some minor differences, but we simply learn a language by comparing our innate predisposition to learn a language with the language that we hear. So we're prepared to learn a language. We're not prepared to learn English. We're not prepared to learn a specific language, but just a language in general. So we use our universal grammar, compare it to what we hear, and we learn language that way. For example, here we'll see all these languages that I show you here. All of these languages have subjects. So the phrase "I love you," you can see the subject for pretty much all of these languages. And in these languages here, for the most part, you see this the word "I" from "I love you" comes before the predicate here. So before the verb. So in a lot of these languages you see it come first, in a lot of these languages you see it come last, where you say "I love you." And you can see I've had students over the years that told me every time I get a new student, I tell them how to say, or I ask them how to say this, and then I write it into the lecture here. So all languages have subjects, but they're not always in the same part of the sentence. So to sum up, what this is saying here is that Chomsky suggests that we're prepared to learn certain rules, and then we learn them from the specific language. So Chomsky and others suggest that we have this language acquisition device. It's kind of a mental organ, so it's not a part of your brain per se, but it's a cognitive tool that we have that enables us to quickly acquire language with very little linguistic input. So for instance, imagine a young toddler around 1 year of age. They hear language all around them, and then this mental organ gets activated, the language acquisition device. It tells us that we're learning language and we're trying to apply the specific aspects of the language to our innate grammar. So we hear that, where we learn about the phonology, semantics, morphology, the syntax, the grammar, and that's essentially how we learn our language and develop our language ability. So some researchers argue that there is a sensitive or critical period for learning languages, and if you see a lot of anecdotal evidence for this. Children who try to learn a second language, we see this a lot in the United States, children who are born into Spanish-speaking families tend to learn English pretty easily if they're in this English culture. But if we try to learn a second language after around puberty, after around 12 years of age, we find that it's very, very difficult. So we would call this a sensitive period for learning language. There's a lot of evidence that suggests this. For instance, children who experience prolonged isolation rarely become proficient if they don't experience language before puberty. The older the people are when they're exposed to a second language, the less proficient they are. You can see that in the graph here. On our x-axis, we have age of arrival for the second language. On the y-axis, we have score on that language exam. And you can see older children and adults have a very, very difficult time learning a second language. Hearing impaired children who learn American Sign Language early tend to be just as good at their syntax and their morphology and so forth and their grammar as children who can hear. But if they try to learn sign language after puberty, they have the same difficulties. There's a lot of parallels between American Sign Language and learning your first language. Also, recovery of language after a stroke or after blunt trauma is greater the earlier that occurs. So we have more developmental plasticity in the first or in the early parts of our lives. So that pretty much sums up the nativist perspective on language acquisition. We also have the social interactionist perspective. The social interactionists, they do recognize that biology is important in our language development, but they say that our environment is much more important. The language that we experience in our social interactions are much, much more important. And that makes sense in terms of, we evolved as a social species, so those who could interact more effectively with members of their species were more likely to survive and pass on, so language could be a tool for that. There's some evidence that suggests this too. For instance, shared attention. Shared attention initiates communication and prompts vocalization. So for instance, mothers, think of this shared attention phenomenon between mothers and toddlers. Mothers who engage their infants in more shared attention and use language and explain the things that they're doing, even to toddlers who do not necessarily understand it quite yet, those children tend to have better language skills. A lot of evidence supports that. Furthermore, gesturing predicts subsequent language development. So children who use their hands to help explain the words that they're saying tend to exhibit better language skills. And you guys could probably note from your classes professors who are very, I don't want to say charismatic, but use a lot of gestures, explain things, point a lot. and use their hands to help explain what they're trying to say, you tend to get it more because you understand a little bit more than just the words coming out of your professor's mouth. So gestures are ways to evoke words and sentences from parents, and you see it even in college as well. Mothers who engage in infant-directed speech, often called motherese, that also facilitates understanding of language. That's the high-pitched sound that we use to talk to young children. They're more likely to pay attention when you speak in a high tone to them as opposed to a low tone. So it's that highly specialized register when you speak to infants that really make them pay attention and are more likely to understand what you're saying. So the bottom line here is that both of these theories really suggest that both the genes and environment influence our language development. There's research to support both, but some researchers take a more nativist perspective and some take a more social interactionist perspective. And like I've been saying all year, you guys have chosen the wrong major if you want black and white answers to these questions. A lot of these answers have caveats and a lot of gray areas and so forth. So it's important to understand the nuance of the development of language acquisition. So at this point, we'll just briefly go over the development or the course of language development over the first couple years of life. Like we talked about before, phonology refers to the sounds that we make. Semantics refer to the meanings of words. Grammar refers to the rules that we have, and pragmatics refers to how we use language in different situations. So let's talk about each of these briefly and how they develop over the first year of life. So phonemes are the sounds we use to make up words. And if you take a look at the top half of my lecture slides here, you can see the development, the phonological development here. You see vocal play, cuckooing, and na-naing. You'll see a lot, before 6 months of age. You'll see babbling, you'll see babbling before 1 year, and then around 18 months, you see a major word spurt as well. There's some interesting studies here, like you see by Safran in 2006. 1-month-olds can distinguish phonemes from any language. But once they turn 6 months or once they get older, they have a more difficult time understanding phonemes from different languages. And what this indicates to researchers is that we become specialized in the language that we constantly hear. So this provides a lot of evidence for the language acquisition device that we just talked about. 1-month-olds can distinguish all of the language, but once they get specialized, they're applying that device to their own specific language. Now, with speech production, around 2 months, like you see up here, like I mentioned previously, you see a lot of cooing. Infants will coo a lot. They're not necessarily talking, but they do make sounds and vocalizations. Around 6 months, you see a lot of babbling, and I'll post this video here. There's a link here as well. Infants will babble. They'll use gestures just like their parents, but they're really not making any sense. So you hear a lot of na, 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 and ba, 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 ba. That's why we often think that kids' first words are mama and dada, but it's not necessarily the case. Around 18 months, children increase their understanding of words and consonants and vowels, and that's really when the word spurt occurs. Moving on to semantics, you can see the semantic development of children over the first 4 years of life on our top part of our screen here. But semantics refers once again to the understanding of the meaning of words. So, like I said, children's first word that they understand and can produce usually occurs around 12 months. Not always the case. And a word spurt generally occurs around 18 months. And you can see here in this graph that the word spurt it can be different between 18-month-old children. So on our y-axis we have every 2.5 week interval starting at 14 months of age. So think of each digit as a new 2.5 week interval or half a month interval. And then on our y-axis we have their cumulative vocabulary, so essentially how many words they know. And you can see in our legend up here that there are different types of word spurts that occur. For instance, the green line here, we see a lot of children exhibit this gradual word learning process. So they don't necessarily have a word spurt, but they learn it in a very progressive way here. Some children have a very short and quick word spurt, and then some children are slower and slower. But just because your future child or your cousin is slower in developing their language skills, it doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It's different for different children. After 22 weeks or something, if you're not, or 22 months, you don't see a lot of words, then you can start doing some tests to see whether there are some language impairments. Receptive language, meaning language that we can hear, really increases over the first year and a half. Children learn many words per day, and they'll remember those words. So if you accidentally swear in front of your 18-month-old cousin, then they're not going to forget that word. And once they start saying it, they're probably not going to stop saying it either. So productive language is a little bit steady. It's a little bit steadier on this graph here. You see on our on our x-axis we had age and months. On our y-axis we have number of words, and you can see that in both the English and Italian languages, receptive language is a lot quicker. We understand a lot more words before we can produce them, and that should make sense. Let's move on to grammar. Morphemes are the smallest unit of language that carries meaning. For instance, let's look at the word talking. Both talk and ing are both morphemes. They both have meaning. So talk is obviously different than talking. Word combinations and morphemes start to expand after the first words are uttered, but children often have this problem of overgeneralization. Let's see here. So children will say stuff like, I hurted myself, or mommy goed to the store, because they don't understand how to combine the morphemes over the first 2 years of life. It might not be up until 4 years where they start saying things in a correct way, and really you need educated on that. So education on language development in preschool and kindergarten is very important for this. There's interesting ways we can test morpheme understanding, and we often call it the WUG test. So you see something like this, we present this to a young child, and we say something on the lines of, this is a WUG. And then we show them pictures of 2 of the WUGs, and we say, now there's another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2 what? And then young children will correctly say WUGs or incorrectly say something else, and then you can gain a better understanding of their morpheme development. Okay? So you can see this. They have the WUG test involves different types of words. So for instance, this is a gutch. Now there's another one. Now there are 2 of them. There are 2 what? The correct answer obviously is gutches. This is a dog with quirks on him. He is all covered in quirks. What kind of dog is he? The correct answer would be he is a quirky dog. Sometimes this test is called the ricking test as well. This is a man who knows how to rick, whatever he's doing in that particular picture. I don't know, but we're going to call it ricking. He is ricking. He did the same thing yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Yesterday he was ricking. So this is an example of the WUG test, and it assesses children's grammar development. Most important, we have pragmatic competence here. I actually think this is extremely important as we get older and older. Pragmatic competence requires that speakers have a high level of understanding the situation that we're in. So it's more than just language, it's also understanding the situations that we're in. So conversational competence is a marker of pragmatic competence. It's the ability to maintain a conversation. It's the ability to use distinct styles of speaking in specific contexts. For instance, let's say you're approaching 3 people. One person, you're going to say, hello, how are you doing today? Another person, you might say, yo, what's up, dude? And another person, you might say, hi there, how are you doing today? Yeah, are you having fun? So those are different speech registers that I use there. Perhaps the first one, you might say that to a professor or to your priest or someone with some sort of authority. The second one, what's up, dude? You'll say that to your friends, of course. And then the third one, hi there, how are you doing today? You might say that to a young child, or if you're like me, you might say it to your dogs. So pragmatic competence really refers to your speech registers and how you change the inflection of your voice and how you can converse with others. So that's pretty much it for today. So really, we had two major goals. The first one is to understand the modern theories of language development, and that includes the nativist theory and the social interactionist theory. And the other major goal today is understanding the different forms of language and how it develops over time. So hopefully, if you can say a few things about each of these different major goals today, you'll be well prepared for this section of the exam. All right, good luck. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.